Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today we have with us Dr. Chuck Lawless, not a stranger to Free Will Baptist. He's been so helpful to many of our churches with the Hope Initiative. Many of our churches also have read his book. I call it The Bubble, Dr. Lawless, but it's been very helpful to help their churches to become outward focused. But for us, it's important to remember he's the Dean of Doctoral Studies and Vice President of Spiritual Formation and Ministry Centers at Southeastern Seminary there in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He also is a professor of evangelism and missions, and he has a past history of, he served as a pastor, I think probably while he was a professor and even before that. So, Dr. Lawless, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, my friend. It's good to be with you always.
So we've talked in the past about the importance of preaching, and one of the things you talk a lot about is how important it is to have preaching teams. And so talk to our listeners today a little bit about what is the value of a preaching team.
Sure. And I will say to you that in my decades now of looking at churches, this at least in my arena is a newer approach. Not that it's new overall, but we're seeing it more in the churches that I tend to associate with, particularly in churches that have a plurality of elders, or often in younger churches, younger leaders who start out wanting to share the preaching. But I do think there are some good reasons to do this. One is as simple as it spreads out the hard work of preaching. And I think, Eddie, about when I first started preaching, goodness gracious, 40 plus years ago, I preached Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and I have no idea how I prepared 3 sermons in a week, except here's what I've decided. I've decided that 2 of the 3 must have been horrible, if not all 3. And so I recognize, if I'm sharing preaching responsibilities, there is value in that. It gives rest to the lead pastor, a time for refreshment, a time for the lead pastor to hear from others. And there are other reasons that I think there's value in this. If the team collaborates on a sermon preparation, you get different voices, different ideas, different insights into a text, and then you build a team of leadership in the church. You show the church part of what it means to be the body of Christ, that God puts other people in our church that can also open the word and proclaim it. And I think too, the other thing that comes to mind, Eddie, is this allows an opportunity for young preachers to get some experience in a safer place, because they're not the ones on whose desk everything lands. They get to experience preaching. They get some critique of their preaching. They get to hear from church people and other preachers. And if they mess up, they get to grow and learn in a way that is productive. So correct. I think there are good reasons for considering a preaching team.
And so, yeah, especially you're talking about young preachers just, they think they're called to preach, and some of them even may not be confident of that yet, but they're getting the opportunity to preach. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking, oh, Chuck's talking about a church of, he's talking about mega churches or, churches of 1,000 people, but really you're not, are you? You can do preaching teams even in a situation where you're the only staff member.
Yeah, I'm really not thinking about mega churches.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would say the majority of churches that I'm aware of doing this tend to be smaller. Some are church plants where a church planting team started out with the idea that we would have on our team some folks who give evidence of an ability to open and proclaim the word. And we start out by saying we're going to share these responsibilities because that's the kind of vision we have for ministry. Other young leaders, even going into traditional churches, I think part of what happens, Eddie, is some of our young pastors have heroes who are from churches with more of a plurality of leadership. They've seen that model. They want something like that. And even if they're in a church that doesn't want to move in that direction by name, they're automatically thinking about who else can I raise up who might give evidence of an ability to teach, who could be at some point potentially an elder in this body. And so they go into it. Even the smallest churches, the leader goes into it saying, I want to make sure that I'm raising up folks who can continue the work of proclaiming the word. Even in the smallest church, that can happen.
And so it's especially easier, though, if you do have those other venues. You mentioned when you first started out, you were doing Sunday night and you were doing Wednesday night. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking, yes, and some of them still have opportunities on Sunday night and Wednesday night. That's a lot, though, to risk on a Sunday morning when somebody tries your church out for the first time, though, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And honestly, I suppose even if you have a Sunday night, Wednesday night, it's always risky when you have somebody preach that you haven't heard. But I think here's the way we have to approach this. So the way I've seen pastors approach it is you set it up in such a way to say, one of our goals as a church is that we want to reproduce ourselves. We want to disciple, to raise up new leaders. We want to prepare the next generation of preachers of the word, the next generation of missionaries. And one of the ways we do that is I, as the lead pastor, I want to share an opportunity for some of our younger leaders, or maybe older leaders that have just sensed a call to preach. I want to share this time with them to give them an opportunity to test their gifts. And I would go so far as to say, Eddie, to my church, I'd want to say, and I want to thank you for being a congregation that shares this vision. And I want you to listen intently. I want you to pray for our brother as he speaks. We'll talk with him after this to help him grow through the process. But that's why we're here. And so thank you for letting us do that. It's doable. It really is.
Now, a lot of times, and I think I've heard you discuss this too, sometimes you can even use a bit of a team approach as a pastor, using other pastors for feedback and bouncing ideas off about outlines and even message ideas and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about how something like that might work.
It's a great question, particularly for pastors who have no other staff members and they look around their congregation and they're not even sure they see anybody else that might have an interest in preaching, but they too want to grow. What often happens for many of us, and I'm an educator, but I have to admit this, is that sometimes we put folks through a couple of classes in preaching, maybe a couple classes, and then we launch them on the real world. And too often we don't get critique past that point. We don't get input from others past that point. And I think we can do better if we allow others that we trust, who can speak truth into our lives without us bowing up, who can say to us, that sermon, the points weren't always as clear, or I didn't really follow that illustration, or in an affirming way, that was one of the best application points that I've ever heard in a sermon. We all need, I would say, 2 or 3 other people, at least one, but I would love to have 2 or 3 that we would get to know. And now here's the good news. You can do this with people, frankly, all over the world, because we can do what we're doing right now. We can meet via the internet. They can watch our sermons via the internet. They can listen to what we have to say while they're running. Then we can meet and just talk through the points. And if you share those responsibilities, so if you and I are doing this, if it's just the 2 of us, you critique my sermon, I critique your sermon, we're going to be more helpful to each other because both of us are on the hot seat a little bit.
Yeah.
And I just think that's a good way for us to grow in our preaching. We just have to take the initiative to do that, because not many people are running around saying, and I'm not sure I would trust someone who came to me and said, hey, I would really like to critique your sermons. I don't know that I would want that.
Yeah.
I would want to be willing to go to a brother pastor, a retired pastor, someone who preaches well himself, to say, I would love for your input. I would love to continue to grow.
That's great. And so it's really, you're talking about iron sharpens iron, and it makes both pastors, both preachers, it makes them better, makes them more effective. And that's really important, isn't it? Because really preaching is more important than it's a biblical, the Bible teaches how important it is, but it's especially needed in our culture. So talk a bit to us about how our culture, we know it's changed dramatically, and especially in the last couple of decades. How has that impacted preaching?
Yeah, I think there are some good things that have happened. I think there's some things that have made preaching tougher. On one hand, the good news all of us have is that we have the good news. The word of God hasn't changed. It still transforms lives. It's still good for teaching and reproof and correction and training in righteousness. It still equips people for becoming the men of God that we are called to be. And so we still have the same message that we can cling to and we can trust the Lord to use. I think one of the things that has happened is the folks we're preaching to now are considering options and asking questions that I don't know that we would even dreamed about when I started pastoring decades ago. Things that have happened in the realm of gender and sexuality, and we could just list the things. The influence of social media, the influence of media in general, so that our folks are hearing from many, many, many different voices. And if you think about it, if they hear us preach once a week, they're coming with a bunch of other voices raising questions for them. And we have 30, 40, however long a brother preaches. We don't have a lot of time to address all those issues. But I think what we have to do, Eddie, is we have to recognize that our folks are asking those questions, or at least having those discussions. And I think that means we have to think about, how do we help people understand the truth of the word and apply it where they live in a culture that's shifting under our feet? And that means, for me, we have to work hard on application of the word. We can't assume that our listeners are going to hear us teach the truth and they're going to internalize it, and they're going to ask themselves the question, where does that intersect with my life? And here's how I change my life on Monday. I don't think we can assume that. I'm not sure we could have ever assumed it, but now I think they hear so many other voices that it's just hard for them to go there. So we have to help our listeners know, here's the truth of the word, here's where we live, here's how the word addresses that, and here's how that changes the way that we need to live as believers. I think if that forces us to apply the word in the lives of our listeners, that's a good thing. The other thing I would say is a bit of a struggle because of social media now. You can listen to about any preacher anytime. Again, I think back to when I started. If I wanted to listen to another preacher, I either had to hear him on the radio or on the television, or I had to order a cassette tape that got mailed to me a month later. Now I can walk out of preaching on Sunday morning and hop on my phone and listen to somebody on the way home. Where I think that's affected preaching at some level is it's easier for us to be negative about our preachers.
Yeah.
When we can listen to a sermon and maybe we don't like it as much, so we just jump online to hear somebody else that we like better. And so we live in a world of, I think, more ready comparison. I think that makes it much more difficult for preachers today. Yet, I would also say, if that pushes us to say, how can I improve my preaching, including teaming up with others to get it done, that can also be a positive.
Absolutely. So really you came full circle there.
I did. You're right. I sure did.
It's as complicated as it could ever be, but it's needed more than ever. And so that's why we want to be as effective as we possibly can, and using other brothers helping us along to sharpen our, iron sharpening iron, so to speak. And because our culture definitely needs the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. So,
That's
hey,
right.
good job there, my friend. Good job.
Thank you.
I appreciate you sharing with us, Dr. Lawless. This has been very helpful to us, and I encourage our listeners to look into some of your books, look into and think about setting up a preaching team, setting up, or thinking, even if I'm a lay person, things that I might be able to do to help my pastor. You've got to be careful about that. But
Sure.
I'll give a quick example. I had a lady in my church that would cut out, when we had newspapers, she would cut out illustrations, and she just passed those things along. And I had a ready-made set of stories and interesting facts, if you will. And sometimes there are ways that lay people can be really effective in some of those things. So if
Yeah,
you're
no, I agree. I agree. And just so that you know, Tom and Sam and I are talking about creating a preaching certification through Church Answers in
Oh,
2024, where
excellent.
Sam and I will be teaching a number of courses that will include some coaching
Mm.
for guys who just want to strengthen their preaching. And so we'll try to keep you informed about that.
Excellent. So keep on the lookout. Be looking for some more help there from Church Answers. And hey, we appreciate the good work you all do. Appreciate everything you're doing. Thanks so much, Chuck, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And we want to thank you, our listeners. Maybe you know someone that would benefit from this podcast. Please take it and share it with them. Remember, every little thing we do, it really does matter. We truly are better when we work together. We're better together. Thank you.